Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that takes history's most decisive moments and, well, we try to extract the knowledge nuggets you need to understand how our world fundamentally changed.
And today we are dropping into 1943. We're now entering the fourth year of a conflict that it's long since stopped being regional.
Oh, absolutely. This is truly global now.
Yep.
You've got every major industrial power pulled in, countless other nations under occupation. It's a world at war.
And if you just look at the strategic map, say at the start of January 1943, the past couple of years have been defined by Axis supremacy. Blitzkriegs, sweeping armored advances, conquests that just seemed endless.
But the 3 months we're dedicating this deep dive to, January through March of 43, they represent something fundamentally different.
They really do. Our sources call this the period when the Axis powers received the hard and heavy tidings.
That phrase alone,
Yeah.
hard and heavy tidings, it just captures the entire shift, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're not just here to summarize events. Our mission is to unpack the meaning of that shift. This is the quarter where the strategic momentum, it just finally breaks for the Allies. And not just in one place, but across 3 massive, completely unconnected theaters at the same time. The confidence of the Axis just begins to crumble.
It's like a global game of dominoes, and all the crucial ones suddenly started falling inward right toward the Axis and in really quick succession.
So what are the big ones?
We have 3 immediate, devastating game changers to analyze. First, the humiliating and really total German surrender at Stalingrad.
The big one.
Then you have the definitive loosening of Japan's hold on Guadalcanal in the Pacific.
And finally,
And the decisive Allied tactical and strategic advantage being gained in North Africa.
it's just stunning when you think that only 6 months before this, the Axis seemed poised to capture Egypt, to crush the Soviet Union, and to finalize their control over the vast Pacific.
And now, suddenly, 1943 begins with the absolute start of this relentless, coordinated Allied advance that's going to define the entire rest of the war.
So let's unpack this monumental turning point. I think we have to start where the conflict was at its most brutal, its most massive, and its most costly. The Eastern Front. The ruin of Stalingrad.
The Battle of Stalingrad, which of course is the city of Volgograd today, well, you can argue it's the psychological turning point of the entire war, if not the operational one.
We talk a lot about Hitler's strategic errors, but this one, invading the Soviet Union, it just seems to be on another level.
Oh, it was fundamentally devastating. He took on an enemy of immeasurable size, and at the same time, he completely underestimated the sheer determination of the Red Army, and maybe most famously, the historical severity of the Russian winter.
And that Eastern Front, which had been the stage for the incredible initial success of the Blitzkrieg, had now become this perilous, resource-draining quagmire for the Third Reich.
It was bleeding them dry.
But Stalingrad itself, it's 600 miles south of Moscow. It seems like a strange fixation for the Fuhrer. Why was this city, named after the Soviet leader, the absolute core attraction?
Well, its location was hypercritical for strategic supply. It sat right on the mighty Volga River.
Okay.
So whoever controlled Stalingrad basically controlled the shipping of vital supplies, food, munitions, you name it, across the entire southern part of the Soviet Union.
So it's a logistical choke point.
A massive one. On top of that, the city's industrial zone, even under all that heavy bombardment, was still churning out armaments. But the real prize, the one Hitler coveted above everything else, was the oil-rich Caucasus region, which lay just to the south.
The oil.
Capture Stalingrad, you choke Soviet logistics, and you fuel the German military machine. It was a 2-for-1.
We know the city had been enduring months of just the most brutal fighting imaginable. The Luftwaffe had reduced it to rubble. Casualties were astronomical, especially for the Russians.
Unbelievably high.
But the Germans had pushed deep into the city. So what happened in November 1942 that just completely flipped the script?
Well, first, the Soviets got very good at a doctrine of close quarters fighting. They used the open ruins to basically negate the Germans' superior mobility and air support.
Fighting in the rubble.
Exactly. But the real game changer was a massive, brilliantly executed Red Army counteroffensive in November 42. They launched 2 huge pincer movements, one from the north and one from the south.
And they went for the flanks.
They sliced right through the weaker Romanian and Italian flanks that were supporting the main German advance.
And in doing that, they completely encircled and trapped the German Sixth Army.
That's it. They trapped over 250,000 Axis troops, the entire Sixth Army plus all their support contingents, in this massive frozen pocket on the west bank of the Volga.
And then the Russian winter sets in.
And it sets in hard. Supplies dwindle almost immediately. We're talking temperatures dropping far, far below zero. Frostbite was rampant, and then typhus, a disease that thrives on poor hygiene and malnutrition, it just started spreading uncontrollably among the freezing, exhausted German troops.
And Hitler's reaction to this was, well, it was catastrophic for his own men. He issues that infamous order, hold at all costs.
It was an operational impossibility, and it was compounded by sheer delusion. The Sixth Army commander, General Friedrich Paulus, he begged for permission to attempt a breakout.
And Hitler refused.
Flatly refused. He promised to resupply the entire massive force by air. Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, promised a daily delivery of 500 tons of supplies.
And the reality?
The reality was nowhere close. On a good day, they might get 100 tons. That's barely enough to feed 1/5 of the men and horses. The pocket just became a freezing, starving hellscape.
So when the Russians finally offered a way out in the new year, I mean, the sense of hopelessness must have just been overwhelming.
By January 9th, 1943, when a Russian captain shows up under a white flag offering Paulus an honorable surrender, the situation was already beyond desperate.
But Paulus tries to hold on.
He does his best. He was a professional soldier, and Hitler had just promoted him to field marshal, which was this perverse attempt to bind him to the no-surrender order.
Why? What was the significance of that?
No German field marshal in history had ever been captured. It was an implicit command to commit suicide rather than surrender.
But the body simply cannot defy reality forever.
No. The German troops were reduced to eating horse meat. And then, the sources are clear, incidents of cannibalism were recorded. It's a chilling sign of the complete breakdown of civilization inside that pocket.
So by the end of January...
By the last day of January, the Red Army is battering its way into the last Axis strongholds. Paulus, the brand new field marshal, retreats into the basement of a ruined department store, and that's where he was captured, utterly defeated.
Let's talk about the grim numbers, because this is where the sheer scale of the Eastern Front's brutality becomes just impossible to ignore.
The Axis casualty tally for Stalingrad is just staggering. At least 120,000 Axis men died in the fighting or from starvation and exposure before the surrender.
And then came the capture,
which resulted in 91,000 soldiers being taken prisoner, including 24 high-ranking Nazi generals.
That's the raw fact. But the real insight here is what happened next, and why only about 5,000 of those 91,000 men ever saw their homes again, decades later.
And this really gets to the nature of total war on the Eastern Front. The German logistical system had totally collapsed, so the men who were captured were already severely weakened by disease, by malnutrition.
But the Soviets?
The Soviets had borne the brunt of this invasion. They'd suffered civilian and military casualties in the millions. They were in no position, and frankly, they had no political will, to expend precious resources on German prisoners.
So they just perished.
Most of the 86,000 men who never returned died in the immediate aftermath of the capture. From disease, from neglect, from forced labor camps, their loss was a measure of Soviet determination. It signaled that mercy was not a resource available in the East.
And we have to emphasize, while the German loss was massive, the Russian losses were even more horrific.
Oh, absolutely. The civilian population of Stalingrad was just decimated. And Red Army casualties killed, captured, or wounded are estimated by sources to be up to 250,000 troops, possibly more. The Soviets paid the most punishing price in human lives for this victory.
The political shockwave in Berlin must have been immediate. This was the first unequivocal, large-scale military defeat for the Reich.
It completely shattered the carefully cultivated image of Nazi invincibility. Hitler, secluded in his headquarters, was reportedly apoplectic. He was berating his senior officer corps.
And this fueled his distrust of them.
Massively. He grew to distrust these professional military men, these career soldiers like Paulus, whom he felt just lacked the ideological zeal to follow his insane hold-at-all-costs orders.
And his distrust in this one instance turned out to be kind of well-founded, given what happened to General Paulus after his capture.
Paulus, the field marshal promoted hours before his capture, became a devastating psychological weapon for the Soviets. After some time in captivity, he became a key figure in a Soviet-sponsored League of German officers.
And what did they do?
He began broadcasting radio messages back to Germany, urging his fellow officers to abandon Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. For propaganda value, this was just immense.
So the tide turned not just on the battlefield, but deep within the German military psyche. And speaking of a small measure of relief, January also brought a vital, though limited success further north in Russia.
Yes, on January 18th, the long-standing German blockade around Leningrad, what is now St. Petersburg, was finally broken.
How did they manage that?
The Red Army managed to establish a narrow land corridor on the southern coast of Lake Ladoga. Now, this didn't end the siege entirely, but it was absolutely crucial.
Because supplies could get in.
Exactly. It allowed more supplies to be brought in for the famished and disease-ridden population, and it enabled the evacuation of more civilians to relative safety. It was, a crack in the wall of suffering.
And this success relates directly to what Stalin had been demanding from Churchill and Roosevelt for so long: relief.
Right.
While a full Western European Second Front was still months away, the Allied actions elsewhere were already forcing the Reich to split its resources.
Precisely. The Allied successes in North Africa, which we'll get to, were already prompting Hitler to divert crack Axis units, planes, and logistical support away from the increasingly desperate Eastern Front. It partially fulfilled Stalin's urgent demand for relief by forcing the Reich to dilute its focus and stretch its logistics thin.
Okay, let's follow that diversion now. We're going to pivot halfway across the globe, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the steaming, sodden jungles of the South Pacific. Let's move to Guadalcanal, the site of the first major Japanese reversal.
The Pacific War was running concurrently, of course, but it was driven by very different geopolitical imperatives. Japan's main goal was to secure resources, specifically the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies,
And to knock out the U.S.
and simultaneously eliminate U.S. naval power in the Central Pacific. Ideologically, Japan was positioning itself as the only nation capable of ending centuries of Western colonial dominance in Asia.
But the fight for Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, it was less about grand ideology and much more about primal, brutal survival.
The sources are all very clear on this. Guadalcanal was not a tropical paradise, it was hell. It meant constant air raids, deafening artillery fire, savage fighting in dense, humid, sodden jungle where you could barely see your hand in front of your face.
And disease.
Disease was a terrifying constant enemy. Malaria and dysentery took a far, far greater toll than enemy bullets for both sides.
The fighting really centered around one crucial piece of infrastructure, didn't it? The airstrip.
Henderson Field. Yes, that airstrip was the strategic heart of the island. Whoever controlled it controlled the skies and therefore controlled the sea lanes. It meant you could bring in your supplies and reinforcements while denying them to the enemy.
And by early 1943, after 6 months of this hellacious fighting,
The Japanese military, which prided itself on its tenacity and, its refusal to retreat, started to recognize the strategic reality. They were defeated.
that must have been a crushing realization for a military culture that glorified death over dishonor.
It was revolutionary. The commanders on the ground had to admit the losses were just unsustainable. And the final decision to retreat was formally approved by Emperor Hirohito himself.
And what's remarkable is how they did it.
It's an incredible tactical feat. They pulled off a massive, highly successful evacuation right under the Allies' noses.
How?
The Japanese Navy used high-speed naval destroyers in early February, and they disguised their movements as preparations for a new decisive offensive. Before the Allies even realized what was happening, the Japanese had successfully evacuated more than 10,000 soldiers off the island.
A tactical success in retreat, but as you said, a strategic failure.
Absolutely.
So Guadalcanal was secured. It becomes a major Allied base, but the U.S. paid a price for it.
They did. About 1,700 American soldiers killed, 5,000 wounded. The cost to Japan, however, goes much deeper than just immediate casualties.
What do you mean?
The loss of material was huge. 860 aircraft, 15 warships. But the greater irreparable cost was the loss of the highly trained crews. Experienced pilots, experienced sailors.
They couldn't replace them.
In 1943, Japan simply lacked the industrial capacity and the training infrastructure to replace these highly skilled personnel quickly. Their strategic air and naval power was fundamentally degraded. This defeat forced a monumental reappraisal of their entire strategy.
So no more aggressive expansion.
Exactly. The Japanese resolved to halt their advance. They abandoned these ambitious plans and instead focused on holding central New Guinea and establishing a rigid defensive perimeter along the southern edge of their control. The Japanese military machine, once seen as invincible, had just been forced into a permanent defensive posture.
This shift in the Pacific brings us back to that ideological dilemma you mentioned earlier, the complexities of empire across Southeast Asia. Anti-colonial nationalists in places like the Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, they face an impossible choice.
It was a horrific calculus. I mean, they had lived under Western European colonial rule for decades, sometimes centuries. Japan comes in and promises an end to that, a vision of Asia for the Asians under Japanese leadership.
So do you believe Japan's promises? Or do you side with the Allies, who are, after all, your established colonial masters?
A terrible choice. And what ultimately settled that matter for many of them was the pervasive, documented brutality of the Japanese military occupation.
Right.
The sources detail the often barbaric treatment of local populations. The Japanese military administration was far harsher than most Western colonial regimes. It became clear that Japanese militarism was just replacing one form of harsh rule with another.
So colonialism became the lesser of two evils.
For many Asian populations, yes. In the face of Japanese atrocities, it absolutely did.
Let's focus on the biggest of the colonial holdings, India. The jewel in the British crown, but also a boiling cauldron of nationalist agitation.
India was critical. The entire British war effort depended massively on Indian manpower. But the loss of Burma the year before was disastrous.
Militarily humiliating.
Yes, but also, critically, it cut off 15% of India's rice supply, the staple food for vast numbers of poor Indians. This just fueled mass discontent and agitation for independence.
And this is where Mahatma Gandhi enters the narrative, demanding immediate independence.
Gandhi and the Quit India movement were, to the British, an existential threat to their authority. The British had zero intention of granting independence in the middle of a war.
So Gandhi was detained.
He was, along with other nationalist leaders. The British responded to the mass protests with mass arrests and, in some places, lethal gunfire against unarmed demonstrators. The priority for them became regaining Burma, not just for strategic reasons, but to demonstrate British control and stability to the Indian population.
And regaining Burma also solves the massive logistics problem of supplying China, which Roosevelt viewed as essential to tying up Japanese forces.
Roosevelt was adamant about this. China, under Chiang Kai-shek, had been fighting Japan since 1937 and was vital. Chiang agreed to cooperate in reconquering Burma in exchange for a lot of U.S. aid and the acceptance of the very abrasive American General Joe Stilwell as his military advisor.
But the main supply route, the famous Burma Road, was closed. So how did Stilwell try to solve this monumental logistics puzzle across some of the world's most difficult terrain?
Stilwell supervised the construction of the new Lido Road, a staggering feat of engineering designed to connect India to the final stretch of the original Burma Road. The scale of the labor was just immense. It relied on 15,000 U.S. soldiers, many of them African Americans from segregated engineer units, and about 35,000 Indian workers.
And the human cost of that construction itself was immense.
It was a continuous battle against the environment. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus took a horrific toll. Hundreds of U.S. soldiers died during construction, as did countless local workers. It just underscores that even the logistics of this war required enormous sacrifices in these distant, often overlooked theaters.
While the road was being built, the first land offensives to retake parts of Burma the Arakan campaign were slow and difficult.
Very slow. The British and Indian troops really struggled against the jungle and the battle-hardened Japanese enemy. This is where the British felt they desperately needed a psychological win, a morale boost.
Enter the Chindits?
Enter the Chindits. This was a British Special Forces unit, about 3,000 strong, named after a mythical Burmese lion. They were the brainchild of Brigadier Ord Wingate, a fascinatingly eccentric and deeply devout officer. Their mission was to operate deep behind enemy lines, launching guerrilla-style raids.
So they were there to disrupt Japanese supplies and give the Allies a much-needed boost. How effective were they, militarily speaking?
Objectively, their military impact was pretty modest. They did succeed in blowing up some bridges, disrupting communications. However, the sources indicate they only managed to take out Japanese railway communications for less than a week.
That's not very long.
No. Logistical failures and Japanese pressure forced them back to India by the end of March.
Okay, so a short-lived tactical success. But the core insight here, as you said earlier, is the massive victory they provided in terms of psychological warfare.
Absolutely. The story of the Chindits was immediately and heavily promoted in the media, both in India and back home in Britain. They were depicted as these invincible jungle heroes, symbolizing the possibility of undermining the Japanese in their own environment. It was a calculated victory of hope and propaganda, and it was essential for maintaining morale.
From the thick jungles of Burma, let's transition now to the arid, rocky landscapes of North Africa, where the ground war was finally reaching its dramatic conclusion. This theater was so critical because it was the first place the Allies managed to coordinate a massive two-pronged advance.
The objective was clear. You had U.S. and British troops who had landed during Operation Torch in Morocco and Algeria pushing east.
Right.
At the same time, you have Field Marshal Montgomery's veteran 8th Army advancing westward from their massive victory at El Alamein in Libya. The goal was to trap the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia, squeeze them.
And this successful Allied encirclement attempt was what prompted Hitler and Mussolini to divert those precious resources away from the Eastern Front.
They poured men and equipment into North Africa, shipping them from Sicily and Italy, desperate to maintain a southern flank and draw Allied attention away from the Mediterranean underbelly of Europe.
A side effect of this was the complete occupation of France.
Yes. This strategic reaction led to Hitler ordering the full occupation of southeastern France. The whole country was now under the Nazi iron hand.
But despite the reinforcements in Africa, the Axis position was just untenable. The fall of Tripoli was a huge symbol of their retreat.
A monumental moment. On January 23rd, Montgomery's multinational forces, South Africans, Indians, New Zealanders, they rumbled into Tripoli, the deserted Libyan capital.
Rommel was gone.
Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, had already retreated, destroying every piece of infrastructure he could behind him. The strategic loss was massive. He lost his main supply base, and for Italy it meant losing the very last territory of their African empire.
But the road wasn't a straight shot for the Allies pushing eastward through Tunisia. The German forces under Rommel were still formidable, which led to the first major confrontation between U.S. and German forces at the Kasserine Pass.
This was a really painful moment of learning for the Americans. In mid-February, Rommel, attempting a desperate counterpunch, drove westwards to try and cut off the Allied supply base in Algeria.
And the Kasserine Pass, a narrow mountain track, became the battlefield.
It became the setting for the first large-scale, direct confrontation between U.S. and German forces in World War II.
And the initial outcome was a heavy defeat for the inexperienced U.S. troops.
They suffered severely. The U.S. troops, many of them completely untested, were still using light guns and light tanks that were just severely mismatched against superior German heavy equipment, especially the legendary Tiger tanks.
So casualties were high.
Heavy casualties, and the morale took a really serious hit.
But the Allies recovered quickly. What changed the dynamics in those crucial few days?
Strategically accurate Allied air power proved decisive. Within days, the Allies, with combined British and American forces, regained control of the pass and pushed the Germans back. And crucially, time was just running out for Rommel.
And this whole debacle highlighted the need for better command.
A major reorganization followed. And that's what brought American General Dwight D. Eisenhower to the forefront of the global command structure.
So Eisenhower was given overall authority for the entire Allied military effort in the Mediterranean.
The whole region. It was a challenging role. He was a brilliant mediator and diplomat, skilled at balancing the egos and agendas of commanders, like the fiercely proud Montgomery and the often sensitive French generals.
And he didn't have much frontline combat experience himself?
No, but his ability to secure the respect of all the frontline commanders made him the perfect choice to coordinate this complex multinational offensive.
As Eisenhower took command, the Axis was making its final stand in Tunisia, building up forces around the city of Tunis.
They concentrated around 17,000 Italian and German forces there. Logistically, they were stretched thin, but they were determined to hold a final bridgehead. They used airfields in Tunis to bring in supplies via airlifts, famously redeploying those invaluable transport planes from the beleaguered Eastern Front.
Another connection back to Stalingrad.
Exactly. And their final major defensive stronghold was the Mareth Line in southern Tunisia.
Describe the Mareth Line for us. How formidable was it?
It was a legacy fortification built by the French before the war to defend against a potential Italian aggression from Libya. The Axis now repurposed this network, leveraging minefields, deep anti-tank ditches, and dense barbed wire. It was a severe defensive challenge.
But by the end of March, Montgomery was ready, and he had overwhelming force.
He had learned the lessons of attrition. He amassed overwhelming superiority. He had about 400 tanks compared to Rommel's severely depleted 160.
And air power.
Crucially, he had unquestioned air superiority. No longer had to worry about Axis harassment from the air. This combination proved irresistible. By the end of March, Montgomery managed a brilliant flanking movement to break right through the Mareth Line.
And that breakthrough signaled Rommel's final exit from the African theater.
It did. Hitler, growing weary of his general's pessimistic reports, summoned Rommel to a meeting in Ukraine. Rommel made a desperate plea to be allowed to evacuate the remaining Axis troops across the sea to Italy.
arguing they could be used to defend Europe.
Yes, re-equipped and used to defend the continent. But both Hitler and Mussolini refused, blinded by this false optimism. Rommel never returned to Africa. He was destined for European operations, leaving his command in other hands. By the end of March, the Allies knew total victory in Tunisia was only weeks away.
So while the Maris Line was crumbling and the fate of Stalingrad was being sealed, the two core Allied leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, were meeting in secret to plot the future course of the war. This was the famous Casablanca Conference.
The timing was so critical. It happened in mid-January 1943, right as Stalingrad was entering its desperate final phase. To maintain total security, Roosevelt, who was flown in via West Africa, and Churchill, arriving in a converted bomber, met at the Anfa Hotel in Casablanca, Morocco.
Which was considered secure territory.
Yes, a French protectorate. They even checked in under these highly cinematic false names, Admiral Q and Mr. P.
Let's talk about the political tensions at the conference. Stalin wasn't there.
His absence was notable. He declined, citing the critical situation on the Eastern Front, but he used his absence to continually remind the Western Allies of their unfulfilled promise to open a second front in France.
And the internal French rivalry was also on full display.
Oh, absolutely. Roosevelt favored General Henri Giraud, a former Vichy supporter and career soldier whom the Americans had groomed to administer North Africa.
And Giraud was intensely disliked by the other key French leader, Charles de Gaulle.
Gaulle, the symbol of the Free French resistance based in London, saw Giraud as morally compromised. Roosevelt and Churchill basically forced the two rival French generals to attend, and while they were persuaded to share authority, their hostility was barely contained. It showed the deep political fragmentation the Allies had to manage.
Despite these internal frictions, Roosevelt used the end of the conference to deliver a major public policy statement that remains controversial to this day: the doctrine of unconditional surrender.
He publicly declared that the war would continue until the Allies secured unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. He stressed there would be no deals, no negotiated peace with Hitler or Mussolini, and that those responsible for atrocities would be put on trial.
Why was it necessary to make such a hardline public statement at that particular moment?
Well, it served two fundamental purposes. First, it was a massive signal to Stalin. It demonstrated total, unwavering commitment to defeating Nazism and its ideology. It was meant to answer Stalin's concerns that the West might seek a separate, negotiated peace.
And the second reason?
It countered the growing public criticism in the U.S. and Britain over the policy of working with former Vichy commanders like Giraud in North Africa. This commitment to total victory and prosecution of war criminals was designed to morally reassure the public.
But the deeper insight, the one that critics still raise, is that unconditional surrender dramatically limited any future political maneuvering.
Exactly. The policy, while it's morally resonant, meant the war had to be fought to the bitter end. It eliminated any possibility of internal dissenters within Germany, those generals already distrustful of Hitler, having any incentive to try and overthrow the Nazi regime and negotiate a peace.
So it might have prolonged the fighting.
It's a serious argument. By refusing to offer any terms short of total submission, the Allies may have prolonged the fighting and inevitably increased the final immense human cost.
Meanwhile, the most crucial decisions made in Casablanca were, of course, kept entirely secret. The next strategic move was decided.
The primary decision about the second front was hammered out. They concluded that the initial push into Europe would be via Sicily and onto mainland Italy, rather than a direct, immediate invasion of northwestern France.
So the D-Day precursor, the English Channel invasion, was officially postponed for over a year. Why was it deemed impossible in 1943?
The logistics just weren't there yet. The Allies, particularly the Americans, lacked sufficient seasoned troops and, more importantly, they lacked the necessary specialized landing craft and naval resources assembled in England for that kind of massive amphibious assault.
But the planning began.
Serious planning for a 1944 invasion began in earnest right there in Casablanca. It set the timeline for D-Day.
They also formalized their bombing campaign over Germany, the combined bomber offensive. And this was given dual goals.
It was a sophisticated two-pronged attack plan. Goal number one was tactical relief for the ground troops. The round-the-clock bombing raids, U.S. by day, British by night, were designed to draw German fighter power, the Luftwaffe, away from the Russian and Mediterranean theaters.
And the second goal was psychological.
Crucially, yes, they aimed to destroy Germany's military and industrial infrastructure, but also, and this is a direct quote from the source material, to undermine the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for an armed resistance is fatally weakened. The bombing was intended to break the German will to fight, not just their factories.
That brings us to the final and undoubtedly most horrifying section of our deep dive. The shadow of terror that was spreading across Europe and how the war was impacting the home fronts in both Germany and Britain.
As the Allies gained ground in Africa and Russia, Hitler escalated his reign of terror across occupied Europe. By early 1943, following the full occupation of France, the Nazi iron hand was tightening everywhere. And most chillingly, 5 death camps were fully operational in occupied Poland.
We need to pause here and make sure we fully clarify the distinction between concentration camps and these death camps. It's an industrial scale of horror.
It is essential to understand this distinction. Concentration camps like Dachau or Buchenwald were places where the Nazis imprisoned political opponents, homosexuals, communists, those deemed socially deviant. They were centers of forced labor and unspeakable suffering, but they weren't built solely for mass killing.
Whereas the death camps.
The death camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz-Birkenau were built expressly and exclusively for industrialized genocide. They were factories of death focused on killing on a scale previously unimaginable.
And the primary target of this industrial killing machine was European Jewry.
Yes. Jewish people were transported from all over Europe, often in horrific conditions, to these camps in Poland. The victims also included Poles, Roma, and massive numbers of Soviet prisoners of war. The administrator of this entire horrific system was Heinrich Himmler.
Himmler, one of Hitler's most powerful and loyal henchmen in command of the SS.
The SS, recruited for their ideological commitment to Nazism and their supposed racial purity, operated far outside the normal German military structure. They controlled the police units and the military units, the Waffen-SS, and they presided over the logistical organization and execution of this industrial-scale genocide. The SS was the core realization of Hitler's envisioned master race.
Amidst this absolute terror, however, pockets of resistance were beginning to stir, even in the most desperate places, like the Warsaw Ghetto.
The Warsaw Ghetto was a walled area in Poland, cutting off the vast Jewish population from the outside world. The conditions were just nightmarish, rampant typhus, tuberculosis, malnutrition. Hundreds of thousands had already been deported to the death camps.
But in mid-January, a rebellion broke out.
A small, shocking rebellion. This was before the famous uprising later that year, but it was a precursor. Small groups of poorly armed fighters, realizing their fate was sealed, attacked German guards and actually managed to kill a few soldiers.
Yeah, and that moment was crucial.
It was, because it forced the Germans to acknowledge that the Jews, though cornered, were actively starting to strike back. It injected this terrifying disruptive element into the smoothly running machinery of genocide.
Meanwhile, back in Germany itself, ordinary citizens were beginning to feel the increasing weight of the war, primarily because of that combined bomber offensive hitting their cities.
The illusion of distance and safety was completely gone. Ordinary Germans were starting to realize the Allies had a decisive air advantage. On January 16th, the RAF returned to Berlin after a 14-month hiatus, dropping 8,000 sizable bombs. 10 days later, American bombers made their first daylight raids on the German homeland at Wilhelmshaven Naval Base.
So it was hitting home.
It showed the Allies' willingness to strike deep into the Reich during daylight hours, and this, combined with the loss of Stalingrad, magnified the internal disillusionment exponentially.
Stalingrad was a catastrophe that just couldn't be concealed.
No. When the final units surrendered on February 2nd, the entire nation was in shock. It fell to Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's most loyal and eloquent associate, to maintain morale through propaganda.
And this is where he delivered his most famous and most chilling propaganda challenge.
Yes, the Sport Palace speech on February 18th. Goebbels was brilliant at theater. He spoke at a carefully staged mass rally in Berlin with hand-picked, enthusiastic participants. And he reframed the defeat not as a catastrophe, but as an existential threat from Bolshevism that required total commitment.
And he asks them that famous question.
He asks the audience, do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can yet imagine?
And the staged audience, of course, roared their approval.
They did, but the sources indicate that outside that controlled environment, approval for Hitler was definitely beginning to crack. The terror of the Gestapo was immense, but examples of dissent were emerging.
like the graffiti appearing in Munich.
Shoppers in Munich city center began seeing anti-Nazi graffiti, small, brave acts of defiance. And at Munich University, the intellectual heart of the city, students actually dared to chant "Down with Hitler" in public spaces.
Which leads us directly to the tragic and inspiring story of the White Rose.
The White Rose was one of the most famous examples of nonviolent German resistance. It was an underground student group, mostly medical and biology students, including Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were just 25 and 21.
And they were circulating anti-Nazi letters.
For months, in several German cities, they were motivated by deep moral convictions. Some of them had served briefly on the Eastern Front and had witnessed the horrifying treatment of Polish Jews firsthand, images they just couldn't shake.
Their letters really encapsulated the profound moral shame that many educated Germans felt, but were terrified to express.
One letter read, "Isn't it true that every German is ashamed of his government these days? Who can imagine the degree of shame when the awful crimes that infinitely exceed any human measure are exposed to the light of day?" They were trying to awaken the conscience of the German people.
But the Gestapo was ruthlessly efficient.
Tragically, yes. They quickly crushed the movement, arresting and executing the school siblings, another student, in late February. It proved the highest price one could pay for voicing public dissent in the Third Reich.
Moving across the Channel, while the German home front faced bombing and dissent, the British public was bearing up under austerity and shortages, their morale buoyed by the good news from North Africa.
The British public was incredibly resilient. The devastation of the London Blitz was mostly a memory by now, though civilian casualties in Britain still, sadly, outnumbered military losses. Austerity and rationing were a way of life.
And everyone was encouraged to contribute.
Government campaigns were everywhere, keeping chickens, cultivating garden patches, the famous Dig for Victory campaign.
And the war effort itself paradoxically created an unexpected social benefit that laid the groundwork for future change.
The massive, soaring government spending required to sustain total war effectively eliminated the mass unemployment that had plagued Britain during the interwar years. And this period of wartime solidarity created a popular demand for radical post-war social change, a feeling that the suffering could not have been in vain.
That vision for a better future was codified in a very unlikely bestseller, The Beveridge Report.
The Beveridge Report, published in late 42 but gaining massive traction in early 43, was revolutionary. It proposed radical post-war reforms, including a new system of national insurance to provide a minimum standard of living and, most famously, a national health service, the NHS offering health care for all citizens.
This offered the public a profound promise.
It was the promise of Social Security from the cradle to the grave, designed to abolish what the report called the 5 giant evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It became this unlikely morale-boosting sensation. It offered the British people a tangible, better future worth fighting for.
However, maintaining that essential national morale sometimes required difficult and controversial decisions by the leadership, even decisions involving censorship.
We see this most clearly with the tragedy at Bethnal Green Underground Station in London on March 2nd. The station was being used as an air raid shelter.
And there was a panic.
A combination of darkness and a perceived sound of a nearby explosion, which was actually an experimental anti-aircraft rocket, caused a panic to sweep through the densely packed station.
And the result was a catastrophic crush.
A crush that resulted in the horrifying deaths of 173 people, many of them women and children, on the stairs leading down into the station. The devastating irony is that not a single German bomb fell there that night. It was an accident born of fear.
And Churchill ordered the news to be suppressed.
He issued strict orders to conceal the scale of the tragedy from the public. He feared that giving the story prominence might severely damage morale at a crucial stage of the war, or worse, provide incredibly valuable ammunition to the German propaganda machine.
A cold, hard calculation.
A cold, hard calculation made by the Prime Minister to protect the national spirit necessary to win the war.
So as we wrap up our deep dives into these pivotal 3 months, let's just reiterate how dramatically the momentum had shifted by the end of March 1943.
The evidence is just indisputable. On every major front, the Allies were gaining ground daily. Montgomery had smashed through the Meerith Line. Rommel was gone from Africa forever. Guadalcanal was secured as a major Allied base, forcing the Japanese into a permanent defensive reassessment. The path to victory was now clear, even if it was going to be long and arduous.
And this shift was hardened by the grim, accumulating awareness of the true evil they were fighting against. particularly the escalating genocide in the East.
That awareness was growing in the West. We know Himmler was informed on March 23rd that approximately 1.5 million European Jews had been killed since the war began. On that very same day, the Archbishop of Canterbury pleaded in the House of Lords for the British government to take immediate action to help the remaining Jews of Europe.
So this knowledge solidified their determination.
It solidified the Allies' determination, proclaimed at Casablanca, for nothing less than the total, unconditional defeat of Nazism.
And as the Allies looked toward the invasion of Italy, Hitler was left in no doubt about their immediate intentions.
Churchill's determination was palpable. The strategic bombing raids on Sicily, combined with the victory in North Africa, left Hitler fully aware of the planned invasion of Italy, the so-called soft underbelly of the Axis powers.
And even amidst the horror the human spirit endured.
Even amidst the gloom and the industrial horror of the death camps, you see that resilient human spirit shining through, exemplified by the small but defiantly planned uprising in the Warsaw Jewish ghetto. It illustrates the enduring will to fight back against absolute evil.
It's clear that January through March 1943 cemented the path to victory, though at an immense, horrifying, and often morally ambiguous human cost.
Which brings us back to that fundamental question debated at Casablanca and still relevant today. And we want you, our listener, to consider this. Roosevelt and Churchill publicly committed to the policy of unconditional surrender. Was that policy, the rejection of any possible deal, the essential moral foundation needed to justify the immense human cost, like the 250,000 Soviet troops lost at Stalingrad, and the controversial tactical decisions like prioritizing Italy over France or suppressing news like the Bethnal Green disaster that were ultimately necessary to achieve total victory over such an evil force?
A profound thought to end on. If you want to explore more stories from this pivotal era and support the kind of detailed research that goes into these deep dives, please check out the official War Stories merch. You can find our shop link right there in the description.
We really appreciate your support and look forward to diving into the next crucial chapter of world history with you soon.